power is not just a tool. It is the ultimate, most terrifying intoxicant known to the human soul. It is a slow-acting poison that whispers into the ears of the righteous, convincing them that the very laws they stone others for do not apply to the golden throne they sit upon. History, in its sanitized Sunday school pages, remembers him as the legendary giant slayer, the poet king who strummed his harp to soothe the divine, a man described by the heavens themselves as being after God's own heart. But tonight, we are not looking at the icon on the stained glass window. We are stripping away the gold-leafed myths to look into the cold, hungry eyes of a predator. We are witnessing the transformation of a hero into a monster, a king who would sign a death warrant with the same hand that wrote the Psalms. This is not just a story about an afternoon bath or a moment of forbidden lust. This is a chilling investigation into the most calculated, high-stakes assassination in biblical history. A crime that triggered a 3,000-year-old bloodbath. A single, lingering glance that unleashed a multi-generational curse, turning brothers into murderers and daughters into victims, until a dynasty was nearly drowned in its own blood. Welcome to the shadows of the palace. Welcome to the forbidden story of David and the woman who would become his greatest victory and his most devastating ruin. Spring had settled over the ancient stone walls of Jerusalem. In the ancient world, spring was the season of blood. It was the time when kings marched out to war, but a strange, heavy silence hung over the royal residence. David, the supreme commander of Israel, had chosen the soft embrace of silk cushions over the harsh reality of the military camp. He sent Joab, his ruthless general, along with every able-bodied man, to die in the dirt of Rabbah. His soldiers were sleeping on the cold ground, facing arrows and spears. Yet their king, the man who once faced Goliath with a sling, remained behind in climate-controlled chambers, safe, comfortable, and dangerously idle. This was the first invisible fracture in the foundation of his soul. For when a king stops fighting his enemies, he begins to fight his own shadows. You think he stayed home for peace? No. He stayed because he had grown bored of victory. He had reached the peak, and there was nowhere to go but down. But what David didn't know was that as he stood on that roof, another pair of eyes was watching from the heavens, recording a crime that would change the Bible forever. The afternoon sun hung low over the jagged limestone horizon, a heavy, molten orb of gold, bleeding its final crimson light across the silent rooftops of Jerusalem. David stood at the highest point of the citadel. The shepherd king, the giant slayer, was now a god looking down upon his world of mortals. The wind carried the faint, sweet scent of cedarwood, mixed with the distant, rhythmic sounds of a city preparing for night. He walked to the edge of the parapet, his shadow stretching long and dark, like a black stain spreading over the streets below. And then he saw her. In a private courtyard, nestled among the stone houses below, bathed in the honeyed light of the dying day, a woman was washing herself. This was not a simple accident of fate. It was a collision of holy duty and unholy desire. The water cascaded over her skin, turning it into polished bronze under the sun's final touch. She moved with an innocent, unconscious grace. Every drop of water that fell from her shoulders struck the stone floor like a drumbeat deep inside David's hollow chest. She was unaware, completely, utterly. She did not know that at the peak of Mount Zion, the man described as being after God's own heart had become a silent observer, a voyeur, a predator. Any man of honor, any leader who truly valued the sacred covenant with his Creator would have turned his back within 3 seconds. He would have retreated to his chambers and sought the safety of prayer. But David stayed for 30 minutes. He stood perfectly still, allowing the dry, dead wood of his imagination to catch fire. He watched her hair fall in wet tendrils down her back. He watched the curve of her form, glistening like a jewel in the fading sun. He was consuming her with a gaze that morphed from accidental observation into deliberate, cold-blooded voyeurism. He had a harem of the most beautiful women in the East. He had concubines from every conquered tribe. He lacked absolutely nothing in the realm of physical companionship. But the human heart is a bottomless pit. When you have eaten every feast on earth, only the forbidden fruit tastes sweet. The giant slayer had no more giants to fight, so he decided to hunt a woman. In that half hour on the roof, the righteous king of Israel died, and a criminal was born. The desire metastasized into action. David turned from the ledge, his breath shallow, his heart racing with a dark, new purpose. He summoned a servant, his voice thick with an urgency that betrayed the rot in his soul. "Find out who that woman is," he commanded. The words carried the weight of absolute power, a power that knew no. The servant hurried out into the narrow, gossiping streets. In a city like Jerusalem, everyone knew everyone's business. Within the hour, the servant returned, bowing low before the paced, restless king. Her name is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam. The name itself meant daughter of abundance. But it was the next detail that should have been a bucket of ice water over David's burning lust. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was not a faceless soldier. He was one of David's mighty men, a member of the elite warriors who had bled for David in every canyon and cave. He was, at that very second, risking his life on the front lines for David's glory. Knowing she was the wife of his most loyal servant should have stopped him. It should have shattered the spell. But power is a monster that only sees targets, never people. To David, Uriah was no longer a brother in arms. He was merely an obstacle to be removed, an inconvenience in the path of a king's hunger. David looked at his messengers and spoke the words. That would unleash a 3,000-year-old bloodbath. "Bring her to me." He thought he was inviting a woman to his bed for a night of pleasure, but he was actually inviting a demon into his palace, a demon that would never, ever leave. The heavy, iron-studded doors of the royal chamber swung open, creaking like a premonition of death. Bathsheba crossed the threshold, moving from the familiar scent of her home into the suffocating luxury of the palace. The air here was thick with the smell of expensive frankincense and the cold and stagnant aroma of ancient stone. She was led past guards who avoided her eyes, their silence acting as a shroud over the king's intent. When the doors closed behind her, the sound was final, a heavy, wooden thud that severed her from her world and from her husband. There was no romance in this room. There was no candlelight seduction or soft poetry. There was only the crushing, invisible weight of a crown that demanded submission. David stood in the shadows, The man who had once composed songs for God, now waiting in the dark for another man's wife. When he stepped into the light, Bathsheba saw not the hero of Israel, but a monarch who had forgotten that even kings are subjects to a higher law. He did not ask, he took. Think about the impossible position of this woman. David was not just a man. He was the king, the absolute ruler of life and death. Her husband, Uriah, was under his direct command. To refuse David was to invite the destruction of her entire household. It was to sign her own death warrant, and the warrant of everyone she loved. In the silence of that chamber, power became the ultimate predator. David satisfied a fleeting hunger, staining his soul for a moment of conquered pleasure, and when it was over, he sent her back into the night. He watched her leave, believing he had committed the perfect, victimless crime. He thought the darkness of the palace walls would swallow the secret forever. Weeks passed in a deceptive silence. David returned to his prayers, to his music, to his laws. He convinced himself that God had not seen, or that God had understood his weakness. But the universe has a terrifying way of balancing its scales. Bathsheba began to notice changes: the morning nausea, the sensitivity to smells, the undeniable life growing beneath her heart. The magnitude of the disaster crashed over her. Her husband had been away for months, fighting in the trenches of Rabbah. There was no way to explain this child. Under the Mosaic law, adultery was punishable by one thing only: stones. She sent a messenger to the palace. No long letters, no explanations. Just two words in the original Hebrew: I am pregnant. I am. When the message reached David, the color drained from his face. The giant slayer, the man who had faced Goliath with a sling, now felt a cold, paralyzing terror. The secret was no longer hidden in the dark. It was now a living, breathing, growing piece of evidence. The scandal would not just destroy his reputation, it would destroy his throne. But David was not ready to repent. He was ready to fight, not with a sling or a sword, but with the calculated malice of a criminal trying to bury a body. Send for Uriah, he whispered. And with those three words, the murder plot began to breathe. The messenger rode hard through the dust, carrying a royal summons that Uriah believed was about the war. When the soldier arrived at the palace, he stood before David, still covered in the grit of the front lines. His hands were calloused from the sword, his eyes weary from the watchfires of Rabbah. David welcomed him with a fake smile, a mask of royal concern. He asked about Joab. He asked about the morale of the troops, hollow questions, designed to hide the pounding of his own heart. Go down to your house, David said, his voice smooth like silk. Wash your feet and rest. It was a brilliant, simple, and lethal plan. If Uriah went home and slept with his wife, the pregnancy would be covered. The child would be his. The king's sin would remain buried in the dark. David even sent a lavish gift of food from the royal kitchen, ensuring a night of pleasure for the returning hero. He went to bed that night, believing his intellect had saved his crown. But the next morning, the palace guards delivered a report that made David's blood run cold. Uriah did not go to his house. He slept at the palace entrance, among your servants. David felt the first sting of panic. He summoned Uriah again, his voice trembling with forced curiosity. "Why didn't you go home? You've been away for so long." And then Uriah spoke. His words were a masterclass in honor, a purity so bright it blinded the king. "The Ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents," Uriah said. "My commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Think about the weight of those words. While David was sleeping on silk cushions, Uriah chose the cold stone floor. While David was violating a soldier's wife, the soldier was refusing comfort out of loyalty to his brothers. Uriah's integrity was absolute, and in the face of such light, David's darkness became unbearable. The king was no longer just a sinner, he was a coward, standing in the presence of a giant, desperate. David kept him for another day. He invited him to the royal table and poured him cup after cup of the strongest wine. He hoped that alcohol would drown the man's discipline. He hoped the wine would trigger the lust he needed to save himself. But even intoxicated, even with his senses blurred by drink, Uriah's loyalty was stronger than his physical desire. He stumbled out of the banquet, and once again, he slept on the hard, unforgiving stone. David watched him from the shadows of the palace. The plan had failed. Manipulation had reached its limit. The king had run out of lies. And it was in that cold, morning light that David crossed the final threshold. If he couldn't use Uriah's love to save his secret, he would use the enemy's sword to bury it. David sat at his royal writing table. The sunlight of the new morning felt like an accusation, but his heart was now as hard as the stone Uriah slept upon. He took a fresh piece of parchment and dipped his quill into the ink. He wrote a single, lethal command to Joab: "Put Uriah out in front, where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." David did not look away as he sealed the letter with his royal signet ring, the same ring that represented justice, the same ring meant to protect the innocent, was now a stamp of execution. In the ultimate act of psychological cruelty, David handed the sealed death warrant to Uriah himself. "Carry this to Joab," the king commanded. His voice was steady now, cold as a winter tomb. The loyal soldier took the letter, the very instrument of his own demise, and tucked it safely into his travel pack. He bowed to his sovereign, thankful for the trust the king placed in him, and rode back toward the blood-soaked siege of Rabbah. Think about that journey. For days, Uriah rode under the blistering sun, guarding that letter with his life. He would have died to protect that piece of parchment. Because it bore the seal of the man he loved, every mile brought him closer to a trap, set by the one person he would never suspect. When Uriah arrived at the front lines, he delivered the message to Joab. The general broke the seal, and as his eyes scanned the lines, even his battle-hardened face turned pale. Joab had done many dark things for David. He had killed in anger and in war. But this was cold-blooded murder, disguised as military necessity, and the victim was standing right in front of him, faithful, brave, and entirely unsuspecting. Joab looked at Uriah, then looked at the walls of Rabbah. He knew what he had to do to stay in the king's favor. "Prepare for an assault," he barked. The next morning, the gates of Rabbah swung open. and the Ammonite warriors poured out like a flood of bronze and iron. Joab gave the order. He placed Uriah at the point of the greatest danger, right under the city walls, where the arrows fell like lethal rain. Uriah fought with the ferocity of a lion. His sword flashed in the sun, cutting through the enemy line. He was a Dung-si, a warrior of legend. He pushed forward, believing his brothers were right behind him. But then, the silence of betrayal hit him. He turned his head and saw the Israelite line retreating. They were pulling back on orders he never heard. Suddenly, Uriah was alone, a solitary island of white linen and iron in a sea of screaming enemies. He did not run, he did not beg. He raised his shield and faced the end as a man of honor. The first arrow struck his shoulder, the second pierced his side. The Ammonite archers on the wall focused all their malice on the lone figure below. Finally, a heavy spear found its mark, driven deep into his chest. Uriah the Hittite collapsed into the dust, bleeding out under a foreign sky. His last vision was not the face of his wife, but the distant, retreating backs of his own comrades. He died for a king who had stolen his bed, and a nation that had abandoned his life. Back in Jerusalem, David waited. And when the messenger finally arrived, bearing the news that the accident had happened, the king didn't weep. He didn't mourn his mighty man. He simply wiped his hands and said, "The sword devours one as well as another." The messenger from the front lines arrived in Jerusalem, exhausted, covered in the dust of a failed assault. He stood before David, and Joab's instructions were clear. If the king is angry about the military losses, tell him Uriah the Hittite is dead. David listened to the report. He showed no emotion when the messenger described the fallen soldiers. But when the name Uriah was finally mentioned, the king's internal tension vanished. The threat to his throne was neutralized. He sent a cold, calculated response back to his general. "Do not let this matter trouble you. The sword devours one as well as another." With those words, David dismissed the life of his most loyal warrior. As mere collateral damage, the news reached Bathsheba's house. According to Hebrew custom, she began the ritual of mourning. She tore her clothes. She sat in the ashes for 7 days. The neighbors saw a grieving widow, but David saw a ticking clock. He waited for the exact moment the legal mourning period ended. He did not waste a single day. Before the tears were dry on her face, David sent his officers to collect his prize. He brought her into the palace and made her his wife. This was not a marriage of love. It was a strategic merger to bury a crime. By marrying her quickly, David hoped to convince the public that the child was conceived in the first days of their union. The wedding was silent. No celebration, no psalms. Just two people bound together by blood and a shared secret. Bathsheba moved from her humble home into the shadows of the royal harem. She was now a queen, but she was also a prisoner of the king's conscience. Months later, the child was born. Asung. David looked at the infant and felt a sense of triumph. The cover-up had worked. Joab was silent. The army was fighting. The people were oblivious. David resumed his role as the spiritual leader of Israel. He led the sacrifices. He sang the hymns. He functioned as if his hands were clean. But while David was ignoring his conscience, the divine court was in session. Every step of the cover-up had been witnessed. The silence of the palace was about to be broken by a man who did not care for David's crown. Twist. David thought he had brought a wife into his bed to satisfy his lust. He didn't realize he had brought the legal catalyst for his own destruction. By making Bathsheba a part of his house, he had officially invited the sword into his own bloodline, exactly as the law of retribution demanded. As David held his newborn son, believing he was safe, a shadow appeared at the palace gates. It was Nathan, and he wasn't there to offer a blessing. He was there to deliver a verdict that would strip David of everything. David sat on his ivory throne. The sun of Jerusalem shone through the palace windows, illuminating a man who thought he had outsmarted God. But the silence of the room was suddenly broken by the heavy rhythmic thud of a staff against the stone floor. Nathan walked into the light. He did not bow. He did not offer the customary flattery of the court. He stood before David, a mirror prepared to reflect a monster. "A matter of justice, my king," Nathan began. His voice was calm, yet it carried a razor's edge. There were two men in a certain city. One was rich, with flocks and herds beyond counting. The other was poor, with nothing but a single ewe lamb. Nathan described the poor man's bond with the animal. It ate from his wooden bowl. It slept in his arms like a daughter. It was the only source of warmth in a cold world. A traveler came to the rich man, Nathan continued, but the wealthy lord was too greedy to touch his own thousands. He reached into the poor man's house to stole the lamb, slaughtered it, and served it for dinner. As the story ended, David's face turned a violent crimson. The hero of the oppressed, the defender of the weak, felt a surge of righteous fury. He stood up from his throne, his voice echoing off the marble. "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die." He even went further, demanding a fourfold restitution, unaware that he was pronouncing his own sentence. The king looked at Nathan, waiting for the name of the criminal, so he could unleash his royal wrath. Nathan did not flinch. He raised a single, unwavering finger, pointing it directly at David's chest. "You are the man." The throne room felt like it lost all air. The gold on the walls seemed to turn to lead. "I anointed you king," the prophet spoke, "for the divine. I gave you the houses and the wives of your master. Why did you despise the word of the Lord? You struck down Uriah with the sword of the Ammonites. You took his wife to be your own. You thought the darkness hidden, but God saw it all." Then came the verdict that would haunt David's bloodline. "Because you have used the sword in secret, the sword will never, ever depart from your house. Evil will rise against you from your own family. What you did in the dark, God will do to you in broad daylight." David's knees buckled. The crown felt like 1,000 pounds of burning iron. The giant slayer was finally defeated. He whispered 5 words that stripped away his royalty. "I have sinned against the Lord." The silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a collapsing dynasty. Nathan left the palace, but the judgment remained. The very next morning, the first blow struck. The infant prince, the son of David and Bathsheba, suddenly fell ill. His fever burned with a heat that no royal physician could break. David did not command his armies this time. He stripped off his royal robes and threw himself onto the cold stone floor. For 7 days, the king of Israel refused to eat. He refused to drink. He lay in the dark, pleading with God to take his life instead of the child's. The palace elders tried to lift him up. They begged him to eat bread, to preserve his strength, but David ignored them. He was a man broken by the weight of his own shadow. He remained prostrate in the dust, waiting for a mercy that would not come. On the seventh day, the atmosphere in the palace shifted. The servants began to whisper in the corridors. They watched the king from a distance, their faces filled with dread. "How can we tell him?" they whispered. "If he was this distraught while the child was alive, what will he do now?" David heard the whispering. He looked up from the dirt, his eyes sunken and hollow. "Is the child dead?" he asked. The servants looked at the ground. "He is dead," they replied. The court braced for a total collapse. They expected the king to descend into madness or despair, but David did the unexpected. He stood up from the floor. He washed the dust of 7 days from his face. He anointed himself with oil and changed into clean clothes. First, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he returned to the palace and asked for food. He sat at the table and ate as if the crisis had passed. His servants were baffled. "Why are you doing this?" they asked. "You fasted and wept while the child was alive, but now that he is dead, you feast." David's response was cold and final. "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me, but now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." The first harvest was over. The child was gone, paid as a debt for the blood of Uriah. David comforted Bathsheba, but the peace was an illusion. The sword Nathan promised was not finished. It was moving from the nursery to the bedrooms of his grown sons. The death of the infant was only the beginning. David thought he had paid the debt, but the sword Nathan promised was now inside the palace walls, turning his own children into monsters. It started with Amnon, David's eldest son. In a dark reflection of his father's lust, Amnon became obsessed with his half-sister, Tamar. He didn't seek love. He sought possession. Through a calculated lie, he trapped her in his chambers and violated her. And just like David had sent Bathsheba away after his night of sin, Amnon threw Tamar out into the street, his love turning into a toxic, burning hatred. Bathsheba watched from the shadows of the harem. She saw Tamar walking through the palace, her royal robes torn, her head covered in ashes. The same ashes Bathsheba had worn for Uriah. The irony was suffocating. She realized that the sin she and David shared was a virus infecting the next generation. David was furious when he heard the news, but he did nothing. He didn't punish Amnon. How could a king who had stolen a man's wife and murdered him exercise justice against a son who had done the same thing? His own guilt had paralyzed his authority. He was a father without a voice, a judge without a gavel. But while David remained silent, his other son, Absalom, Tamar's full brother, was watching. Absalom's heart turned into a cold stone of resentment. For 2 years, he waited. He invited Amnon to a feast, and in front of everyone, he ordered his servants to strike him down. Blood for blood, a son for a daughter. The palace, once a place of music and psalms, was becoming a slaughterhouse. Bathsheba saw it all. She saw the look in David's eyes as he received the news of his firstborn's murder. It wasn't just grief, it was recognition. This was the sword moving through his house. Every time David looked at Bathsheba, he didn't just see the woman he loved. He saw the woman who reminded him why his children were killing each other. Their relationship was no longer about silk sheets and stolen glances. It was now bound by a shared funeral shroud. The ghost of Uriah was no longer in the grave. He was standing in the hallways of the palace, watching the king's legacy crumble. Absalom, the son who had murdered his brother to avenge his sister, was no longer content with waiting for a crown. He began to steal the hearts of the people at the city gates, whispering that the king was too old, too distracted by his own guilt to lead. The sword, Nathan promised, had finally grown large enough to threaten the throne itself. A full-scale rebellion erupted. David, the once mighty warrior, was forced to flee his own capital in tears, barefoot and humiliated. He left Jerusalem to his son, but he also left something else behind, to show his total dominance. Absalom set up a tent on the very same roof where David had first looked at Bathsheba, in broad daylight, in front of all Israel. Absalom violated his father's concubines. The public shame was absolute. The sin David committed in the dark was now being repaid in the blazing sun, on the exact spot where his eyes had first sinned. Bathsheba was with David in the wilderness. She was no longer the young woman bathing in the moonlight. She was a survivor. She watched the king collapse under the weight of his son's betrayal. The relationship that started with a stolen night was now a shared exile. Every report of the war, every death in the forest of Ephraim, was a reminder of the price of their union. When the news came that Absalom was dead, caught by his hair in a tree and pierced by Joab's spears, David did not celebrate a victory. He wailed in agony, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would I had died instead of you." Bathsheba heard his cries. She knew that David wasn't just mourning a son, he was mourning the cost of his own choices. The victory felt like another funeral. But as the dust of the rebellion settled, the dynamic between David and Bathsheba shifted once more. The passion was gone, replaced by a cold, political steel. They had a son now, Solomon, and Bathsheba knew that in a house filled with blood and murder, her son would only survive if he sat on the throne. She was no longer just David's wife. She became his strategist. She became the guardian of the future. She looked at the aging, broken king and realized that their story wouldn't end in the bedroom, but in the power struggle for the crown. Time had done what no enemy could. David, the giant slayer, was now an old man shivering in his bed. No matter how many blankets they piled on him, he could not get warm. The fire that had once burned for Bathsheba and later for war was now a cold ember. As the king's breath grew shallow, a new crisis emerged. Adonijah, David's eldest surviving son, did not wait for his father's blessing. He declared himself king. He gathered chariots, horsemen, and the support of Joab, the same general who had carried David's blood letter years ago. The cycle of rebellion was repeating. Bathsheba knew that if Adonijah took the throne, her life and the life of her son Solomon would be over. In the brutal politics of the ancient world, a new king often wiped out any rivals to the crown. The woman who once bathed in the moonlight now had to walk into the darkness of the king's final hour to secure the future. She did not go as a victim. She went as a queen mother, With the guidance of the prophet Nathan, the same man who had once condemned her relationship, she entered David's private chambers. She bowed low before the dying king. "My lord," she spoke, her voice steady and sharp, "did you not swear to your servant that Solomon my son would reign after you?" She pointed out Adonijah's betrayal, reminding David that his word was the only thing standing between her and a death sentence. In that moment, the old David flickered back to life. One last time, he exercised his royal authority. He commanded that Solomon be sat upon his own mule and anointed at the Gihon spring. The trumpets blasted throughout Jerusalem. "Long live King Solomon!" Adonijah's rebellion collapsed in an instant. The sword had finally stopped its swing. David died shortly after, leaving behind a kingdom built on blood, but a future secured by the woman he had once stolen. Solomon ascended the throne, and his first act was to honor the woman who had fought for him. He didn't just give her a seat in the court, he placed a throne for the king's mother at his right hand. The story of David and Bathsheba began on a roof with a look of lust. It passed through adultery, murder, the death of a child, and the collapse of a family. But it ended with Bathsheba, the survivor, standing as the most powerful woman in Israel. The Forbidden Bible teaches us that while David's sin created a curse, Bathsheba's resilience created a legacy. From their union, despite its dark beginnings, came the wisest king to ever live. The shadow of Uriah was finally laid to rest. But the story of the king and the woman who survived him would remain etched in blood and gold forever. The story of David and Bathsheba is not just a footnote in history. It is a brutal testament to the nature of power and the persistence of consequences. David remained a man after God's own heart, but he carried the scars of his sin until the day he died. He showed us that forgiveness is free, but restoration is expensive. He spent the rest of his reign trying to outrun the shadow of a single afternoon on a rooftop. And Bathsheba, she was the one who paid the highest price. She lost her husband. She lost her first child. She saw her family torn apart by rape and murder. Yet, she is the one who stands in the genealogy of the Messiah. Out of the ashes of a destroyed home, she built a throne for the wisest man who ever lived. The sword Nathan promised did eventually return to its sheath. Solomon's reign brought peace and unparalleled wealth to Israel. He built the temple that David was forbidden from touching because David's hands were too stained with blood. But even in the gold of the temple, the echoes of Uriah's death remained. History judges David for what he took, but perhaps we should remember Bathsheba for what she saved. She transformed herself from a victim of a king's lust into the mother of a king's wisdom. The Forbidden Bible reminds us that no throne is too high for the eyes of judgment, and no sin is too dark to be woven into the tapestry of destiny. As the sun sets over the ruins of Jerusalem today, the stones still remember. They remember the king on the roof, the woman in the garden, and the price of a crown that was bought with blood. Next time you look at a hero, ask yourself, what are they doing when the war is away? And what shadows are they hiding behind the gold?